Okay, so let's pick this back up where we left off here. And this just is sort of the beginning of putting it all together. And this is just sort of meant to be a little bit of a cheat sheet for you until you get comfortable with the closing the transaction questions. And the idea here is to just get familiar with what column each of these items goes in. Whether it is a buyer debit, buyer credit, seller debit, seller credit. And again, it doesn't matter what order you put them in, as long as you have credits and debits for each party. Is everybody okay on that? So, for example, you're fine. For example, the sales price, the top line right there, sales price. Notice it shows up in two columns. It's both a debit from, think about it from both parties' perspectives. Who does it impact? The sales price. It impacts what?
Both.
Both of them, so it's got to go on both sides. Are we giving that money to the buyer or taking it away from the buyer, the sales price? We're taking it away, so that's a debit on the buyer side. And are we giving that money to the seller or taking it away from the seller, the sales price? We're giving it to the seller, so that's a seller credit. So the sales price shows up as a buyer debit and a seller credit. Is everybody okay with that? Now the next two you need to pay attention to, because the next two will be ones you'll get wrong if you're not really on your toes thinking about it. The due diligence fee. Which party does it impact? The buyer, the seller, or both? Both. And the reason it impacts both is because the buyer paid it and the seller what? They got it. They already have it. When did the seller get that due diligence fee? As soon as we went where? Under contract. That should be an instant answer, by the way, for you. If you can't fire that back instantly, then you are woefully inadequate on Chapter 10. And that's probably a quarter of the exam, Chapter 10, by the way. Chapters 9 and 10 together, if you're going to pick something to study, 9, 10, and the license law. Contract law, the specific North Carolina offer to purchase and contract, and North Carolina license law. People struggle. And that contract stuff, you cannot ignore it. I mean, you've got to get it nailed down. When is that due diligence fee paid?
The beginning. At the beginning.
The beginning of what? As soon as we go in. Under contract. Paid by who?
The buyer.
To who?
The
seller. So, if it was paid by the buyer, do we need to take it from them again, or do we need to give them credit for it? We need to give them credit for it. If it was paid to the seller, do we need to take it back from them or give it to them again? Which one do we need to do? Take it back from them. Take it back from them. And here's the thing, your brain doesn't want to accept that because you're greedy. It's like all the rest of us. What did we just give the seller credit for on line 1, folks?
Sale price.
The full sales price. If we gave them credit for the full sales price and they've already got the due diligence fee, don't they now have too much money?
Yes.
So what do we have to do with that due diligence fee?
Take it away.
Take it away. So that's why the due diligence fee is a credit to the buyer and they what?
Debit.
Debit to the seller. Does that make sense for everybody? Are you with me? Okay? The earnest money is handled differently. It's still a credit to the buyer because the buyer paid in advance, so we need to give them credit for it. Why do we not do anything on the seller side?
Because they don't get the money.
They never had the money. Where is that earnest money deposit?
In a escrow.
It's in, it not only is it in a trust account, it better be in the closing attorney's trust account at this point. Because on the day of closing, that money needs to move to the closing attorney's trust account because it becomes part of the transaction. But we don't need to take it from the seller because the seller never got it. All right? The mortgage loan, the buyer's new mortgage. Well, obviously it only impacts the buyer. Is it a debit? Are we taking the money from the buyer or are we giving it to the buyer?
Giving it to.
We're giving it to, so that's a buyer credit. Commissions, who pays the commission?
Seller.
The seller does. Are we taking it away or giving it to them?
Taking it away.
Taking it away, so it's a seller what? Debit. Excise taxes, who pays those?
Seller.
Seller does. Taking it or giving it? Taking it, so that's a seller. Debit. Loan expenses. Who's getting a loan? The buyer is. So who would pay all the loan expenses? The buyer. And are we taking that money from them or giving it to them? Taking it. So those are all buyer debit. So examples of loan expenses. Origination fees would be a buyer debit. Discount points would be a buy or debit. Interim interest would be buy or debit. Everybody okay on all those? Other stuff that might show up. Property taxes. We just talked about property taxes. Notice I give you two examples here, because property taxes could show up either way. They could show up the way they are here on the top line, as a buyer debit and a seller credit, or they could show up as a buyer credit, seller debit. Remember, that depends on which one of the lines you're circling. When you're doing that property tax proration, you're going to follow whichever. If you're debiting the seller, you're going to do what? Credit the buyer for the same amount. If you're debiting the buyer, you're going to credit the seller for that same amount. That's the way you always handle property taxes. Recording fees could be either party. That's why they show up here. Pay attention to the verbiage. Who would record a deed or a deed of trust? What party would have those documents at a closing?
The attorney, the buyer.
The buyer, right? It's the buyer's deed that would need to be recorded. It's the buyer's deed of trust on their new what? Loan that would need to be recorded. So if they say, fee to record the deed of trust, who's going to pay that? Buyer. You need to know that's a buyer expense. How about if they say a fee to pay the seller's satisfaction of mortgage? Or a fee to record the seller's satisfaction of mortgage? They did pay the mortgage off, but the fee to record the satisfaction, who would pay to file the satisfaction? The seller. It's their loan that's getting paid off. So it's the seller debit. Homeowners insurance. Well, we don't care about insurance for people who are leaving. We care about people who are coming in. So who's going to be paying for homeowners insurance? The buyer would be. That's also sometimes called hazard insurance. It means the same thing. That is very different than mortgage insurance. Homeowners and hazard insurance cover the property in case of damage. What does mortgage insurance cover? The loan in case of default. Good. Escrows for taxes and insurance. Well, again, we don't care about taxes and insurance for the people going out. We care about taxes and insurance for the people what? Coming in. So that's going to be buyer debit. The process is simple. Total up all the debits for the buyer. Total up all the credits for the buyer. Subtract. That's how much money the buyer owes. Everybody okay on that? Total up all the debits for the seller. Total up all the credits for the seller. Subtract. That's how much the seller's going to get. And I've had people say, what if I come up with a negative number? Which one do I subtract from which one? I'm going to tell you in this class it doesn't matter, folks. Now in the real world, you need to know, in the real world, but not for the test, you need to know that it's buyer debits minus buyer credits. And it's seller credits minus seller debits. In this class, it doesn't matter which order you do it in. Because it's always going to be cash that the buyer has to bring to closing and cash that what? The seller is getting at closing. I don't care if you come up with a negative number, it just means you subtract them in the wrong order. But for your purposes, it doesn't matter which one you subtract from which one, as long as you subtract the two buyer columns from each other and you subtract the two seller columns from each other. Is everybody okay on that? Don't worry about the negative and positive. It does not matter for you guys. For you guys on the test, it doesn't matter at all. We feel pretty confident with the process. All right? Here's where your confidence is going to get shattered. Right there. This is an example of what you will see on the test. This is what a closing statement question, and this is why I said when you get to it, what are you going to do with it? You're going to skip it and come back, because it could take you 10 minutes to sort through what you got. I had somebody say one time, give me 30 minutes to read it. Okay. Now, here's what I'll tell you about this thing. Nothing in there is hard. In fact, it's probably some of the easier math in the whole class. It's just there's a lot of it. There's so many moving pieces. What you have to remember, though, is they're all tiny little pieces. And your job is to break them up into tiny little pieces. Your job is not to fumble around and pick and choose the ones you like. If you come to one that you don't know how to do, guess what? You're going to get the whole thing wrong. Skip the whole question. Because if you can't calculate one piece of this thing, guess what you're not going to get? The right answer. Does that make sense to you guys? So when you're practicing it, get out of the habit, because everybody has this habit. Well, I know how to do discount points, and I know how to do origination fees, and I know how to do, but I don't know how to do the property taxes. I did everything except the property taxes. Great for you. You just wasted 45 minutes of your life. Because if you can't do the property tax proration, are you gonna have any chance of getting the answer correct on the test? No. So when you do these, when you practice these, don't skip around. What are you going to do? Line by line. You're going to eliminate it. Now, for some of you, what could help as a coping mechanism is to put this into bullet point format. I've had people who will take the time. Remember, you're saving it for the end. You've got nothing else to do. I've had people who can handle it better in bullet points. And so here's what they'll do. Tom is purchasing a home for $250,000. They'll literally go, bullet point, $250,000 purchase price. And then they mark that through that. And then they go, and they're not trying to do it. They're not trying to work with it. They're just trying to break it out into something they can read and make sense of. Does that make sense? Because now what they're going to do when they come, once they get all their bullet points, what do you think they're going to do? Start working with them one by one and check them off. So what would the next bullet point be? Closing when? May 18th. That's the next piece of information. You see, so now you can mark through that. You see where I'm going with this? And what would the next bullet point be? $500 due diligence fee. And then what would the next one be? $2,500 earning. You see how I'm doing it? Just breaking it out into pieces. And then when you start to deal with them, you can just kind of check them off as you go. That helps some people because this is very intimidating to look at when it's in paragraph format. I don't care whether you want to use it in paragraph format and mark them out one at a time, or if you want to make it into bullet points. Whatever you want to do, but deal with them one at a time. Don't skip things. Because if you're skipping something, you're being just honest with yourself about what it takes to really get this question right. It takes getting the whole thing right. It's a perfection question. And so you're really wasting your time by skipping around because if there's something you don't know, you're going to just be guessing on the final answer anyway. Are you with me on that? That's just a realistic look at this question. So, here's what I want you to do. And I'm going to make myself available as you raise your hand. I want you to do this one. I want you to go ahead and take a clean sheet of paper and you're going to set up your 4 columns. Buyer credit, buyer debit, seller debit, whatever order you want to put them in. And you're going to start working with these things one by one and putting them in place. And I'm going to walk around and look as you do. And I'll wait a couple minutes and then a few minutes and I'll put it up on the solution up on the screen so that you can refer back to them as you look. I need to go get some more blank paper.